Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Politics Guys with your hosts, Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My co-host this week, as always, is Cleveland area attorney and sometime Republican strategist Jay Carson. Before we get to today's show, I wanted to let you know that we've got a new contributor to the Politics Guys newsletter. Leah, a good friend of mine who not only has degrees in political science and public administration, she's also got over a decade of real-world experience in public policy, something I in my ivory tower, don't have. But this week, Leah shares her thoughts and links on healthcare reform, problems with nonprofits, the week in misogyny, and more. I'm sure, Jay, you'll be interested in hearing that.
I am.
Now, along with Leah, you'll also find links and comments from my fellow political scientist, right of center Guy Trey, and Joe, our lovable and zany resident Here's How You Got Trump correspondent. Joe's always interesting. Now, to get the newsletter, just go to our website, politicsguys.com, and sign up on the form you'll see there. You can also check out previous issues by clicking on the past newsletters link above the sign-up form. And now, on to this week's show. Our top story this week is the continuing legal saga of President Trump's executive order banning entry to refugees and immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. The nationwide temporary restraining order on the ban, issued by federal district judge James Robart, a George W. Bush appointee, was quickly challenged by the administration. This week, a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the petition to reinstate the ban. So, Jay, what did you think about the decision, and what do you think is likely to happen next?
Well, the decision, here's the problem that this has had throughout. First of all, we should back up and say this is very much an unforced error by the Trump administration.
Oh, yeah.
There could have been, they screwed this up bigly. There could have been a lot of different ways to do this, where even if it's knocked down by the court in part, you're at least making a good case. You're at least putting forth evidence. The biggest problem, I think, with this is the likelihood of success on the merits piece of it, where the Ninth Circuit is essentially saying, no, the president doesn't have the authority to keep aliens out, and that is seems to be very much at odds with the jurisprudence that's gone before. The other piece of it is the standing question. Do colleges and universities have standing to come into federal court to get an injunction because they believe either students or employees might be adversely impacted by this executive order? And again, that's sort of a heavy lift to say this is irreparable harm because of this order, and that the president doesn't have, even if it is irreparable harm, that the president doesn't have authority to make those decisions. So I think it's really problematic for the Trump administration if he were to pursue this course. Now, something interesting, of course, happened in the last day or so, is that there has been a judge who has requested that the Ninth Circuit hear it en banc, which means it goes to a broader panel of the court as opposed to a 3-judge panel.
Right. There were a couple of things that I thought were interesting about this. Number one, I guess, is this argument that the Trump administration, or attorneys for the Trump administration, made, was that essentially that the courts just can't review this. And it seems to me that one of the best ways to get the court to sort of push back is to tell them you've got no business reviewing this in the first place. And they did push back pretty hard on this. A second thing I wanted to bring up was, the point that you made about them kind of messing it up. I think it seems to me that while I would agree that that the administration is within its legal and constitutional rights to keep some people out, I think if they had made the executive order more targeted and focused only on those people who don't already have visas and green cards, they probably would have been on a lot firmer legal ground. And in fact, there's some talk,
absolutely.
Right, and there's some talk that they might actually roll out a new, more targeted executive order to make that clear. And I think in that instance, it's still a policy that I very much disagree with. But, as we've talked about before, Jay, just because I disagree with something doesn't mean that it's illegal or unconstitutional. At this point, I think I know I disagree with it, and I think parts of it are unconstitutional and illegal, but I think that can be modified so that I will still disagree with it, but they can get around that.
Yeah, something that's interesting from the, you mentioned the visa and green card. That goes to more the due process problem, which is what the court in Boston ruled. And I think the court's right on that. Listen, if because the way the law works with due process is if you have some sort of vested right or interest, the government can't take it away from you without giving you notice in a hearing. And that's just sort of the basic simple point of it. Right. So if you are a person who had a green card, who are otherwise were pre-authorized to be in the country, and all of a sudden the government up and takes that right away from you without giving you notice in a hearing, yes, there's a due process problem. And those people would certainly have standing to sue. Again, I think it's less clear, this third-party standing that, College or university says that we may be affected because some of these other people who are affected, who they're not actually suing, but, we'll sue for them.
Reasonable people can definitely disagree about that one for sure. It's not that slam dunk. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and although what you said a second ago of you think you would, I'm trying to think how you phrased it, that, it would seem to be if we lessen the impact. Yes and no. I mean, in some respects, either the executive branch has the authority to make these decisions or it doesn't. If it makes a broad decision, if they say they wanted to ban travel from 15 countries rather than 7, or from 3 rather than 7, the legal principle is the same. And that is the executive gets to decide, and the judiciary doesn't get to second guess whether that's a good idea or not a good idea. So, I think when we take out the due process thing for the folks, who have some sort of vested right.
Sure.
That's where I disagree. Now, on what happens next, I think the Trump administration would be smart to go back and rewrite this and give it another shot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they probably will, which doesn't mean that they won't still continue their challenge here. And of course, we'll see what form that takes, this coming week. Another thing I wanted to mention is you mentioned the due process issue, but there's also, at least potentially, an equal protection issue. And this is the argument that this executive order was intended to discriminate against Muslims and favor Christians. And as part of the justification for that, people have been pointing to President Trump's own statements and tweets and so forth, suggesting that he did intend to favor Christians over Muslims and did intend to instigate what he called a Muslim ban, and not just for these countries. And so here's a case where some of his very fiery and inflammatory campaign rhetoric might come back to hurt him as president, though that remains to be seen.
Sure. And first, I would say, does that those remarks, are they this is legal stuff, not political stuff? Sure. Are those ever properly before the court? The standard rule is you don't start digging into the intent of a usually it's Congress, but in this case an executive order, unless there is some sort of ambiguity that would require you to look to what do they intend by this. And I think the big answer to it's geared to keeping out Muslims. I think the answer to that is Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all the other more populous Muslim nations with whom who are not on the list and who we continue to accept people coming and going from. So if it was a Muslim ban or intended to ban Muslims, it is terribly ineffective. Right. I think Trump made some statements regarding Christians getting priority. And again, I think that can be, you can make the argument of, listen, if our goal is to protect those who most need protected, Christians in the Middle East, in particularly Syria, would be refugees who would need protection. That's not to say that other Muslims don't need protection, and I think that's where he's short-sighted. Is there are plenty of Sunni moderate Muslims who are equally persecuted by ISIS, but I'm not. I mean, his statements screw things up publicly. I don't think it changes much judicially. But I mean, I think the other fascinating thing is what we're going to see now is he's going to play this out, I think, on a couple different fronts. I mean, the first is the en banc request, which is something that Trump doesn't control, didn't initiate. That's going to be up to the court. They have to get a certain number of votes to determine whether or not they want to hear it en banc. My sense is the end result will likely be the same, but what you'll get is some dissents from some other judges in that circuit, which I think is probably beneficial to the Republic,
right,
to have that dissenting view.
And we should be clear to this point that no judge has ruled on the actual merits of this. I mean, this has all been about temporary injunctions and whether or not they should be. Correct. And so this still has a long ways to go in the court system for sure.
Right. It still plays out in front of Judge Robart.
Yeah.
And again, Trump could get out of that were he to withdraw this order and substitute a new one.
Yeah.
That would render that case moot. But I don't know whether he wants to do it. I think there's maybe, if I'm the Trump administration, you sort of have a little bit of a second chance to, one, take your time and craft a reasonable, good executive order that's going to withstand judicial scrutiny, or even if it gets knocked down, at least is going to have some more political legs to it.
There are a couple other things I wanted to just briefly mention before we move on, because it's been a busy week. But number one is when you take a look at public opinion polling on this issue, it's all over the place, and a lot of that has to do with question wording, but it seems to be fairly clear that there are, large portions, in most cases, majorities of Americans who are actually in favor of something very much along the lines of what President Trump is doing. And I'm not arguing that because it's popular, it's right. I think that, that you can certainly argue against that, but it's important to keep that in mind, is that there are an awful lot of Americans who think that President Trump is doing exactly the right thing and are glad to see it. And the second thing I wanted to point out is, once again, Donald Trump has demonstrated that his instinctive response to any sort of criticism is to try to delegitimize that person or that institution that's criticizing him. We've talked about this before, and it continues to be troubling, and I continue to be troubled by it, and I know you are too.
No, and I was really upset. This is sort of funny because I know I for some reason continue taking heat for being too soft on Trump. But the statement that the so-called judge and so forth, that's way across the line. That is not something that a sitting president ought to do. And it's completely inappropriate. The same thing goes with the sort of the mocking the Ninth Circuit. Believe me, I'm one who's going to disagree with the Ninth Circuit plenty of times, but there is a way to do it and there's a way not to do it. I don't understand it. It angers me and upsets me, and it ought to upset conservatives across the board.
Absolutely.
Just as conservatives were upset by Obama sort of lecturing the Supreme Court on Citizens United. There's this sort of it's something that ought not to be done, and there is a strong, there's an unwritten constitution that sort of floats out there, and I don't want to start sounding like one of these living constitution guys, but it deals with tradition and how we regard our co-equal branches as co-equal branches. That was a big problem. And lastly, because I'm probably talking about this too much, but it's something that sort of hits close to home. I mean, there is a sense, in the legal community. I mean, it's sort of a something that you say sometime is listen, understanding that judges aren't always going to get it right, and that sometimes there are going to be injustices. The sense is we're still better off with respect for the court, even if the court is having a wrong decision, than to start delegitimizing the court.
Absolutely.
It's just one of those basic truths that, and that's something that's a lot of times hard to deal with, that when you say, look, they did something that is absolutely wrong. But there it is. So
yeah, absolutely. Moving on, it's been yet another very busy, very dramatic week in terms of Senate confirmations. Voting largely on party lines, the Senate confirmed Tom Price as Secretary of Health and Human Services. No big fan of Obamacare there. Rex Tillerson was confirmed as Secretary of State. Betsy DeVoss was confirmed as Education Secretary, and Jeff Sessions was confirmed as Attorney General. Now, the DeVoss and Sessions confirmation votes got most of the attention, I'd say. Democrats fiercely opposed both of these nominees. The DeVoss vote ended in a tie, and Vice President Mike Pence cast a tie-breaking vote to confirm her, 51-50.
That's the first time in history a vice president has cast a tie-breaking vote for a cabinet appointment.
Yeah, and, that's unusual. Obviously, by definition.
First time.
Yep, exactly. But it is not, as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said, it does not mean that it's a rigged cabinet. And it bummed me out to see somebody on my side using the same sort of language to delegitimize the process that Donald Trump uses as a matter of course. And so, boo Chuck Schumer on that, but Schumer on that. Sorry. And the DeVoss. After the DeVoss vote, you had the vote on Jeff Sessions, right? And this got a ton of coverage because during the debate before that vote, Massachusetts Senator and very likely 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren was silenced by the Republican majority for imputing unworthy conduct to another senator when she read from a letter written by.
She did more than just impute it.
She was reading from a letter written by Coretta Scott King that was in opposition to Sessions' nomination for a federal judgeship in 1986. So clearly, Jay, you have some thoughts about this. I mean, do you think that was a smart thing, a good thing for the Senate majority to do to shut her up? What do you think?
Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
For a couple reasons. Reasons. All right, let's walk through this.
You misogynist?
Misogynist, yes.
We'll talk about that.
First of all, the Senate rules say that this is something you can't do. The Senate has this longest history of being this civil body, even during the pre-Civil War period. This rule of comity and civility was observed, and she went outside of that, and she knew it, and she intended to do that. And quite honestly, her whole point was to force Mitch McConnell into invoking the rule and silencing her so she could be a martyr. So he does that, and McConnell has to at some point enforce the Senate rules, because otherwise, what is he? You know what I'm saying? Otherwise, if you're not going to enforce the rules, then that's a problem for the body as a whole.
Well, let me ask, before you get on to another point, let me ask you this. A couple of years back, I believe it was Marco Rubio who, on the Senate floor, essentially called Mitch McConnell a liar, and there was no Rule 19 invocation then. So it seems to me that this is a somewhat selective thing. Now, I agree with you that the Senate is well within its rights to invoke this rule, but I think that it's very selectively done. I would argue from a strategic standpoint, it was a stupid thing for the Senate majority leader and the Senate majority to do, because it gave Senator Warren much more of a platform than she would have others. If someone's trying to become a martyr, you don't help them do that. I mean, if that's what she was doing, and I think there's something to that. So I think tactically it was an error. I think it was a bad idea, just all the way around. I think they fell right into what Senator Warren wanted them to fall into. So from my side, I think that works out just fine. But I got to say, I think your side really muffed it.
All right. Well, Mike, if you remember back in the day, you and I used to play chess a lot, late night dorm room chess games. And you got to think a couple moves ahead. If I'm Mitch McConnell, and the question is, who would I like the Republican Party to run against in 2020? A moderate Democrat or someone to the farthest of far left Democrats? Who would you want if you were a Republican to run against?
Well, this sounds suspiciously like the logic that got us Donald Trump as the Republican nominee and the president. So I see where you're going with this, but I think you are giving them far too much credit. But go ahead.
If look, it's you got to look at how things are going to play out. Elizabeth Warren's going to do this. McConnell's going to be compelled probably to invoke the rule.
Compelled.
So he does this, and she is painted, or she becomes a hero to the far left, the farthest of the far left, and she becomes the front runner and starts sucking up the money. And super, that is the candidate that you want to run against.
I suppose it's possible. Let me say one other thing just about the letter itself. I think a reasonable person could say in response to this, saying, well, this was 1986. This was over 30 years ago. And even if we say that, yes, Coretta Scott King was exactly right on that, I would say a more rational and reasonable response would be say, okay, are you saying that people are incapable of change and that we should take some 30 plus year old charge against somebody to be a measure of who this person is today? I think that folks should be confirmed or not confirmed based on their record, based on what they've done, and not necessarily just on some letter from 30 years ago. Jeff Sessions, like any other Donald Trump's nominee, should rise and fall based on their qualifications, and I don't think that really happened to the extent that I would like to see.
Well, I would, as you're probably not surprised, I'd go further than that to say the instance which that letter was complaining about was a situation where he took steps at the instance of black plaintiffs to prosecute so-called activists. So that if the man is racist and you're going to accuse him of racism because he has supporting black plaintiffs on one side against black plaintiffs on another. I think that's just sort of telling as to how far the left is going to go to try to spin this narrative, and I think it's widely inappropriate. And again, he's also the guy who helped get the death penalty for hate crime killers. He prosecuted the Klan and so forth, but it's sort of the easy, he's a racist because he's from Alabama.
There's a logical fallacy that I know you're familiar with called appeal to authority, right? And I think that's sort of what's going on here is, well, if Coretta Scott King says that Jeff Sessions is a disgrace and saying that essentially he's a racist back in 1986, therefore this must be true, and in 2017 he must also be a disgrace and a racist. And maybe that's so and maybe that's not, but I'm saying that there needs to be an argument on the merits and bringing forth some of the things that you talk about. I mean, I could certainly make a strong case against Jeff Sessions, I believe, just based on things that he's actually done, votes he's actually taken while he was a senator. And there was a lot less of that debate, and I think that's really too bad.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let's always limit it to the stuff people have actually done and stuff people have actually facts that we know to be true rather than just allegations.
Absolutely. Before we move on to our next, go ahead, Jay.
Oh, can I talk about DeVoss just for a second? Though?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And this is something that I think is telling. There were a couple pieces in the Wall Street Journal last week about this, but she has faced this fierce push across the country, and everyone call your senators. And is anyone, and I'm going to say something that is going to rile a lot of feathers. For conservatives, you won't be riled, but the idea that the Democrats would spend this much political capital, this much of a push for the Secretary of Education is really stunning.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I see what you're saying.
I mean, to most conservatives and most people, look, I'm going to say it, and this is going to really upset some people. The Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, does not do that much.
Well, they don't. I mean, it's just people can get riled, but it's true.
Somebody send me a list of here's the greatest all-time secretaries of education. We survived quite well with this department until the mid-'70s. And some people might say, geez, is the mid-'70s, that's when education really took off and really got great. But she is a flashpoint because she is for choice. That affects the teachers' unions. That affects the money that's coming in. And this is a financial decision and appeal to the base to keep them riled up.
Just to be clear, for people who don't know, that teachers' unions they're some of the strongest supporters of Democrats, and so the idea that there's a Secretary of Education who is opposed to a lot of things that teachers' unions believe in, and certainly a big fan of charter schools and for-profit schools, that strikes directly at something that a core Democratic supporter group holds very dear. And along that point that you made,
and most all that policy is made at the state level anyway.
Yeah, and there was an article in Vox this last week called "A Comprehensive List of What Betsy DeVoss Can and Can't Do Next," and certainly Vox is certainly no fan of Betsy DeVoss or practically any of Donald Trump's nominees. But as I read through it, it basically said just along the lines of which said, "Can she do a whole lot? Not without Congress, no." And so, I think that I agree with you that a lot was made of it, and I don't know that they've really burned much political capital, but I think it's understandable when we think about who the primary interest groups are that support, the Democratic Party.
Well, but here's where they burned the political capital is that, and there was some really great remarks from Senator Cory Booker, who spoke at DeVoss's group's meeting earlier last year, praising her and the group for their stance on bringing choice to inner city students. And so one group that they're burning a bridge with is inner city parents, which is part of their main demographic, and they were sacrificing that group to the teachers union. And I think that's going to be telling down the line, and the hypocrisy, if you look at the Booker statements of, again, praising this woman and the organization that she created less than a year ago, and the sort of savaging that she got from the same people this year. That tells you what's going on.
Well, I think that Betsy DeVoss has taken a good idea and has taken it way too far. I think, without a doubt, and this is where I break from some liberal orthodoxy, is that there are real problems with K through 12 education, and part of it has to do with the stranglehold that teacher unions have had. And I think that needs to be addressed, but I think she goes too far, and the whole push I think there's a lot to be said for, in some instances, for vouchers in charter schools, and maybe one day we'll want to do a whole episode on that, though I think we'll probably agree on a lot. But once you start getting into for-profit schools and you start to get on different and lower standards for some of these for-profit things, that I think is going too far in that direction. And I think that's what Betsy DeVoss does. And I think that's part of what I feel is at least some of the principled opposition to her nomination to be education secretary. So,
all right.
Now before I move on, we would like to thank our new supporters this week. First, we have Mike from Higginham, I think it's Higginham, Connecticut. Mike writes, "I find your show refreshing as you are both civil with each other and aren't afraid to disagree with your preferred party." Just, I guess, like me on the liberals and education there, right there. So,
there you go.
Yep. He said, "I'm curious to hear more about the defunct TPP that you both seem to agree would have been better if it had passed. My understanding is that this was a pretty good trade agreement, except for some power grabs by big business that were way over the line for what you would expect in a trade agreement. There was tremendous opposition to this by some very smart people. I sure would love to hear that viewpoint. And, I told Mike, and I'd like to tell all our listeners, that trade is an issue that both Jay and we both tend to have some pretty strong opinions on. And I think we both, Jay, wouldn't you agree, have some issues with Donald Trump in that area?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm a free trader, and
as am I.
Now, again, I think there's always room to discuss the specifics of any given agreement.
Sure.
Is a good deal, a bad deal. But I think, my starting point is always from the point of there ought to be, fewer tariff barriers, more free trade, then that helps everyone.
Yeah, and what I'd really like to do, and I hope we'll be able to do this at some point in the near future, is devote a whole episode to the ins and outs of this, because a number of listeners have had questions on that, and I think that would definitely be worthwhile to do an episode on trade policy, the winners, the losers, and that sort of thing. So I have put that on the agenda. I know, Jay, that would be, I think, it's something that you'd love to launch right into, and I think that'd make for a great episode.
Yes.
All right. We'll put that on the agenda. Okay. Next is Marlando, a generous supporter of ours through PayPal. I don't know where he's from, but I do know that we greatly appreciate his support. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now, if you're interested in supporting the show financially, you can do what Mike and Marlando did this week. Go to politicsguys.com and click on either the PayPal or Patreon donation links you'll see there. Every donation helps, no matter what the amount is, and we are truly grateful for whatever you can do to help us out. It's especially helpful for us to have continuing monthly supporters. That's something really easy to set up in Patreon or PayPal. That allows us to make it easier to know what to expect as we move forward with the show, so that's really helpful. And finally, it would be a big help if you could spread the word about the show by sharing and retweeting our new show posts on Facebook and Twitter, and leaving reviews and ratings of the show on iTunes. All right, on to our next story. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump said a lot of pretty out there things, to put it mildly. Things that would, in my view, make any reasonable person more than a little bit apprehensive. And in some instances, I think President Trump seems to be doing his level best to make these campaign promises a reality. I would suggest, the travel ban and other things. But here's some encouraging news. I don't use the phrase Donald Trump and encouraging news often in the same sentence, but here we go. At least when it comes to certain aspects of foreign policy. In a number of instances, the Trump administration has pretty clearly backed off some of their extreme campaign rhetoric. For example, candidate Trump seemed fine with more illegal Israeli settlements, but President Trump now says that settlements don't help the process. Candidate Trump said, "We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem." But President Trump now says, "I'm thinking about it." Candidate Trump said he'd rip up the Iran nuclear deal, but President Trump's advisors recently told the European Union's top foreign policy official that the United States would, in fact, fully carry out the agreement. So, Jay, what do you make of this? Is Donald Trump mellowing?
He is an eminently reasonable man.
Oh. Yeah.
Well, a couple things. On the settlements, I think that's interesting. There is maybe a little bit of a only Nixon could go to China kind of thing there, where he is the Israelis are coming off a presidency which was what we can characterize as being less friendly than what they've been used to.
Sure.
And Trump has promised great support for Israel. But he's taking the step that's saying, listen, he's not going to roll back settlements, but that further settlements are not helpful to the peace process. Now that's in some respects just stating a truism, but it's also communicating that the U.S. would be willing to work, and if Israel is willing to give a little bit, we'd be willing to help move things, towards a reopening discussion.
I think that's in part kind of along the lines of what you said. It has to do with the Trump administration's top people having conversations with our allies in the region, most notably, almost certainly, Saudi Arabia, and they're being told, hey, listen, if you don't want to make a bad situation worse, you're going to step back from some of this, and if you really are serious about trying to put together some sort of a peace deal, as every administration says it is, a lot of times it feels like was it Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football thing? I mean, but every administration comes in wanting to do this, and if they could, it would be an amazing coup and a wonderful thing. And the way to do that is not to encourage these settlements, and is not to do something so inflammatory as moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which would have no particularly wonderful positive effect, but would really, really upset a lot of people in the Arab world.
Yeah, the other thing about the moving of the embassy, and this is just an interesting piece, is that's sort of a almost perennial presidential promise. And Obama even said that at one point back in 2008. Had said, Jerusalem is the capital and so forth. But it never happens. And I think it's one of those things that you sort of play to certain audiences, but that in the real world, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Now, in terms of tearing up the Iran deal, I always love the tearing up. It's like laying around somewhere in some drawer, and he's just going to find it.
I'd like to see him on YouTube just doing that exactly. If you could post a link to it.
No, President Trump, you tore up. That's not the right one.
Yes.
He has on the one hand pushed for, he said the Iranians are on notice now after the missile launch, a ballistic missile which was plainly in violation of what they're supposed to be doing, and had written in Hebrew something along the lines of death to Israel. So if you wonder what kind of message are they trying to send?
Yes, it's not subtle.
No, I think he can certainly pressure Iran without tearing up the nuclear deal right away. And I would say even just to tear it up is to some extent counterproductive, because you're kind of playing your best card for last. Let's keep that thread out there and see what else we can get moving forward. I think that's just kind of the way you play this.
And also, I think
it might get torn up eventually.
Well, I think it's important that just the general principle that we are a country that honors its agreements, and if maybe we want to, the president wants to try to renegotiate or something like that, that's a different story. But we just don't simply decide to ignore agreements that we happen not to like all of a sudden. That's just not.
And that sends a message to all the other folks that we have agreements with on things that are much more prosaic than nuclear expansion.
Exactly. I should also mention that the Trump administration said actually that no, we do believe in the one China policy. That idea that Taiwan is not, it does not have kind of any independent. We're not going to recognize
really China,
them and so forth. Exactly. And so that was something that candidate Trump was talking about. Well, I don't know, seemed very friendly with Taiwan, and now he's kind of coming back into the fold and that. And I think, this is just a broader realization that foreign policy requires a lot of agreements and a lot of working together with other sovereign states. And also, I think if you take a look at Donald Trump's, the people he's chosen to surround himself with, there are a lot of people that I have huge problems with. But the least insane, the most kind of conventional of his nominees, I think, tend to be largely in this region of foreign policy. And so I think that's a less bad thing. I'll almost say a good thing. Although, of course, any Republican nominees for these positions are going to be less favorable to me than someone that, say, Hillary Clinton would have chosen.
Yeah.
So, all right, speaking of foreign policy, even though President Trump's policy may start to be seeming more conventional than initially expected, when it comes to Russia, there are a lot still of unanswered questions. For instance, this week, the Washington Post reported that National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, the well-known progenitor of these Flynn facts, discussed the
Mad dog.
Yes, exactly. Discuss the possible. That's Mattis, isn't it? Yes, it's hard to keep the nicknames straight. That's fine, But Flynn discussed the possible removal of sanctions with Russian officials during the transition. Now, this is not only potentially a violation of federal law, but the revelation, which, according to this article, was corroborated by 9 current or former government officials. This seems to stand in contrast to previous statements from the administration, including from Vice President Mike Pence, that say that no such talks took place. So, Jay, do you think there's something of concern here?
Well, yeah, this is one of these things. It's going to be a dust up, but it's going to go away. It's a concern, I think, for Mike Pence. It's a concern for these other folks who are more traditional Republicans who deal with the Trump team, who don't want to see themselves get undercut. Now, I wasn't on the phone call, as you might expect. I typically am in on these kind of things, but so I don't know what was said, what was discussed, and so forth, and to what extent, who brought up sanctions. The idea that it's illegal, that goes back to, this is one of the first shows we did. We talked about this, the Logan Act.
That's right, 1799.
Yeah. And I don't even remember the context in which we brought it up. But, the idea with the Logan Act is that private citizens cannot conduct foreign policy.
Which seems like a wise idea, generally speaking.
Yeah, but I think in this case, first of all, no one has ever actually been prosecuted under the Logan Act.
That's right.
For all that time, just because, again, it's sort of tough to do. And this time you have an outgoing administration and you have discussions between, the incoming representatives and ambassador. And I would say that's probably, for the most part, pretty standard, par for the course kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think there's more. I don't think there's the story here that the mainstream media wants to gin up of the, there's the secret deal that we've got with the Russians and so forth. I think to the extent it's problematic with Republican Trump allies who are going to be a little bit circumspect in dealing with them because they want to make sure that, they don't find out if they go out and stick their neck out for them, that they're not going to find out that, what they said isn't true, the next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Another big Russia story came from CNN, which late this last week reported that U.S. investigators had corroborated some portions of that memo that alleged collusion between Russian officials and Trump campaign staff, which would be, a huge deal, obviously.
It would be a big
treason,
deal, yes.
Yeah. No, and this is a big but. The only parts that were corroborated had to do with conversations between Russian nationals and not between Russians and anyone involved with the Trump campaign. So this is one of these kind of very misleading headlines. Now, when asked to comment on this, I think it's fair to say embattled White House press secretary Sean Spicer said, "We continue to be disgusted by CNN's fake news reporting." So, Jay, I guess I have two questions here. Number one, should CNN have run this story? And number two, is it to you disgusting fake news?
No, they should not have run the story. This is the same problem I had with CNN when they ran the initial story, which they said they weren't running. It's one of those sort of here's some like a bunch of crazy stuff we've got. It's unverified, and we're going to put it out.
Just to be clear, because we had a number of listeners chime in on this. CNN, that initial story, didn't actually run that story. They ran news of BuzzFeed running that story, so it was not a CNN story. Right. It was a BuzzFeed story, and so I just wanted to make that correction. But still,
well, and I'll report here that I'll run a story that Michael Baranowski is a child molester. I don't have any proof of that, but there's these other people out there who are saying it, and here it is. So, that's sort of,
I hear what you're saying.
Again, we talked about this before. I mean, if CNN you are a news organization or you're not, and if you're just going to report a rumor that someone else comes up with, I don't think that's news.
Well, let me partially agree with you on this. Okay, I think that the way they reported it was irresponsible. However, I think they could have reported it in a way that was less sensationalistic without that clickbaity type of headline. Of course, it wouldn't have gotten nearly the play and wouldn't have gotten the views and so forth, but that would have been perfectly acceptable, responsible reporting. They chose to sensationalize to the... So I don't think it's something they shouldn't have done. I just think they should have done a better, more responsible job of it, and it would have been less of a story, which obviously would not have been in CNN's economic interests.
Well, that tells you where their head is then.
Well, I think it's true for most media.
And then as far as this next piece of, I saw the headline, too, of it's corroborated. And I'm like, my gosh, shocking.
Exactly.
And, I clicked. No, it's not.
Yeah.
And this is something that, unfortunately, there's the complaint about fake news and the stuff, the partisan press that's out there. What happens is your Slates and your Huffington Posts and your, even beyond that, these other meme making sort of social media groups take that and they report just the headline.
Yeah.
And again, this is taken then as truth. It's taken with, it has that CNN imprimatur on it, that, hey, this is not just something we're making up. CNN has verified that Donald Trump, we have in fact corroborated the dossier. And it's just isn't true. And I think there's the term fake news is sort of amorphous, and that's something I think where we get mixed up.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because it seems to me now that pretty clearly the talking points have been passed along to the Trump administration that when they disagree with something or when they take issue with something that's reported, they're not going to call it irresponsible. They're not going to call it bad or poor or incomplete reporting. They're just going to flat out call it fake news. And now that, to me, is going way over the line, because it's not fake news. It's news that you may disagree with the reporting. You may find it sensationalistic, but calling it fake, once again, calls into the question the very legitimacy of the thing with which you disagree. And that shuts down argument right there. That's been one of the primary, drivers of, I think, of Trump administration communications policy. I think it's a horrible thing. I think it's one of the things that I'm most concerned about in this administration. I don't think it's going to stop. And, they're just dead wrong on this.
I think the bigger disconnect is between sort of the nomenclature that we're using. You and I, when we talk about fake news, there is, and again, this is a term that sort of originated with the left, are stories that are whole and completely fabricated.
Exactly, lies.
That, this is not something that they are just sort of misreporting or spinning. It's something that never actually happened. It is something that they are just completely making up. There was a wonderful story on the New York Times a couple weeks ago about this guy in Ohio who does this fake news, and he does it really quite lucratively. Mm-hmm. And I thought, man, we're in the wrong business.
No kidding.
And he sort of admitted to, yes, I just, sit down and make stuff up.
And that's not what CNN or any of these outlets are doing. And that's the problem is that the Trump administration is choosing to not engage, but to just dismiss as fake. And, we already have a huge problem with polarization. And Donald Trump's whole campaign was based on just shutting down and delegitimizing all opposition. Yeah, exactly. And he keeps on doing it. And that, to me, I don't buy the whole Donald Trump is going to be the end of democracy things. I think that's an overreaction. But in this one area, I think this is hugely consequential, and it's a major problem.
I think it's completely fair, and it's heartening for conservatives to see someone who hits back against the media. Now, the use of the term fake news, again, that you and I agree that is inaccurate, but it resonates.
Well, sure it does.
With a whole lot of people who see this, who look. Let me put it this way: they would see the sin of creating something from whole cloth, not too differently from intentionally spinning something to make it sound a whole lot worse than it is. For example, saying, "Oh, the dossier has been corroborated," when the people writing the story know damn well that the key points in the dossier that would make a difference to President Trump and any potential illegality have not been corroborated, but they're intentionally withholding that information or leaving it till later in the story. And to the average guy on the street, they see that as, if not fake news, then let's call it fake journalism. I mean, fake objectivity, I guess, maybe. I think
this just encourages the worst tendencies of people who already don't trust government and institutions, and just kind of work on that, use that for this sort of personal political policy gain, what have you. And that's something that's been to this point outside the bounds of what's considered fair and decent conduct. And once again, President Trump shows that he doesn't give a damn about fair and decent conduct. And in that sense, I think he's a dangerous man.
Well, this goes back, and I think, again, it's part of maybe just the conservative experience versus the liberal experience, that conservatives have dealt with this for decades.
Not like this. I think you're wrong, but go ahead.
If you recall back, this was sort of a minor turning point, but it certainly didn't help. Back in the 1992 election, the New York Times ran a story about Bush campaigning somewhere, showing him at a cash register scanning a pair of socks.
With the barcode reader, right? Yeah.
The barcode reader. And the way the picture was captioned and the way the story was written is, Bush is looking on and with this look of amazement on his face. And it was portrayed as, listen, this guy is so rich and elite and out of touch, he doesn't even know they have barcode readers at stores where you can, scan your socks. When in fact, the actual story was this was a special barcode reader, new technology, that if the barcode was ripped up or marred up, it can still read it. Which Bush found impressive.
Yeah, but
this story was run, and it influenced the election. I mean, you can say I don't know how much, but it was.
But I see what you're saying, and I agree. And back then, was
that fake news?
No, it wasn't fake news. That was spinning something, and it wasn't. If you actually read back on that, they didn't actually say President Bush does not know what a barcode reader is. People certainly may have gotten that impression from the picture. But the New York Times, but the New York Times didn't just flat out lie. I mean, so it's not fake news. Words matter. These distinctions matter. Donald Trump is over the line, and this is just flat out wrong. And that's kind of my final word on that.
Sure, Trump's over the line. But let's go back. What about Newsweek drawing in the extra explosions in some of these West Bank raids? This was back, probably 5-8 years ago. When there was an Israeli.
I agree with you on that. Okay, that when you doctor,
the picture would look a lot better. If I doctored it and photoshopped and more stuff blowing up.
Just like I believe it was either Time or Newsweek during the O.J. Simpson thing, where they doctored the picture to make him look more sinister, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that absolutely is lying. That is fake news. But that's a lot. Sure. Well, that was just poor reporting, but that's different than just making stuff up like that guy in Ohio is doing. That's a whole different thing.
I agree. It's a different thing. But if you're a conservative who has lived with this kind of stuff, this other sort of stuff, for 20, 30 years, and I'm not even going back into the, before that, do you understand why that claim of fake news would resonate with them?
Sure, I do. Okay, fair enough. On that, I see what you're getting at here, and certainly I think it's fair to say that the mainstream media absolutely has preferences. I would argue it's particularly clear editorially, not so much in news coverage, but yeah, I see what you're saying there, and I think that provides an opening for a demagogic manipulator like Donald Trump to use that for short-term gain and try to destroy even more credibility in our institutions.
Agreed, and I agree with you there. And the best way to stop that is for the press to kind of clean up its own act.
Well, I think that would help, and I also think the president has a responsibility here too. All right, well, I didn't know that we'd get quite that much into fake news, but there it is. So that pretty much brings us to the end of our show for this week. Thanks everyone for listening, and of course, if you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or questions about we don't do fake news, but about our show in general,
right.
Our alternative facts, you might think. Yeah, we don't. But, just send us an email. We're at mail@politicsguys.com. And check us out on Facebook, too. We post stuff there all the time. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also very active on Twitter @politicsguys. Jay, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you, but I've started personally responding to some of Donald Trump's tweets. I don't know why. I couldn't help myself. He hasn't responded back yet, but I'm hoping to get this whole kind of Donald Trump can't handle coming on the Politics Guys and the withering sort of question, But anyway, we'll see.
That'd be fun. It
would be a lot of fun. I think, it'd be...
Also, if people really, really missed me last week, which I know you did, you can catch me on Pantsuit Politics with Sarah after our major podcast crossover event last week. I'm on there discussing just Trump and the position of the Republican Party.
Yeah, and they've definitely checked that out. There were both Sarah and Beth were great, and we were really happy to be able to do that. Also should mention that we would absolutely appreciate it if you could subscribe to the show, leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever podcast service you use. And of course, what would be really helpful is sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets. And if you'd like to support the show financially, well, you probably know how to do that. Go to the website and click on either of those Patreon or PayPal links there. And finally, if you enjoy the show, you should definitely check out the Politics Guys weekly newsletter. You can take a look at previous newsletters to see what you'll be getting into. Sign up to have it delivered to your email box, all on our website, politicsguys.com. The Politics Guys will be back next Sunday. We hope you'll join us.